Hello, and welcome to How to Automate Onboarding to Your Entire Stack. My name is Justin McCarthy. I'm the co-founder and CTO of StrongDM. All right, and today we're going to be talking about infrastructure access. And we're going to hear about how Olive AI automated some of those access problems. We're going to see a bit of that hands-on. And then we're going to have time for some Q&A at the end. With me today, we've got Kellen Anker. So Kellen, thanks for sharing and developing this presentation for us today. I'd love it if you just got us started by sharing a bit about what you focus on over at Olive AI.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Hey, everybody. Like Justin said, my name is Kellen Anker. I'm an infrastructure engineer on the CloudOps team at Olive AI. So to touch a little bit, like you asked, what it is that we do and what I do, a little bit more about Olive first, just for some context. Olive is a healthcare AI, artificial intelligence and automation company. We specialize in automating away the routine tasks and the monotonous day-to-day activities that hospitals, healthcare providers, payers, insurance companies, clearinghouses, et cetera, would traditionally have to worry about in the healthcare space. And by doing so, freeing up lots of time for them to focus on what is really important, which is providing care. One of our favorite phrases at Olive is death to faxes and death to clipboards, because that's currently the state-of-the-art methodology by which hospitals and healthcare providers exchange information. We want to put an end to that. So that is our core functionality at Olive. Continuing on this thread about Olive, we employ a little over 1,000 employees at this point. And our network of hospitals and care providers spans around 1,000, over 40 different US states. I think the count is around 42 now. When this also includes around 1/5 of the top 100 healthcare systems in America. And if you've ever worked at a healthcare company before, security and compliance is our number one priority, is paramount, right? So we are a HIPAA compliant entity, which drives a lot of our decisions at Olive. To bring it back to what I specifically do, I focus on, I mentioned I was on the CloudOps team. My role entails facilitating and provisioning and configuring the various systems on which Olive's applications and services run, right? So we're in Amazon shop. We primarily function out of Amazon Web Services. So I'm responsible for configuring servers and Lambdas and what have you, and different deployment pipelines for our engineers, for our team, and all of our other technologically focused teams at Olive. With that was included database access, which is the genesis of why we looked for a product like StrongDM in general. So I mentioned we were at 1,000 employees, and that was not always the case. I say crazy fast hiring on this slide because we truly were experiencing some hyper growth in the last year and a half. When I was hired 2 Februarys ago, I was employee, I think 199, maybe 200, and we're over 1,000 now. So we really did experience some explosive growth in the last year and a half. And if you've ever been in a high growth company, you know that growing pains are an inevitable part of this process, right? With this crazy fast hiring of sometimes 40 people per week at certain moments, there were the org structures, the team structures, the access patterns for these teams were effectively constantly in flux. And with introductions to new leadership and new team captains, et cetera, there were a plethora of new tools and technologies and services that these teams decided that they needed to perform their services and their jobs effectively, right? Whether it be a new Amazon service for the data layer that we manage, or a new client to access an existing service, right? That those patterns were constantly evolving as we hired more and more people and grew our organization. And we found, just purely as a numbers reason, the ability to audit who was doing what and where and when became harder and harder. We always had the network layer access, network layer auditability in all of our systems. But at the application level and who was doing what at a database, for example, was very, very difficult for us to query without some complicated scripting and logic and automations involved. And again, this was feasible to pull when we had about 50 engineers, but now we're over 1,000 employees, and this became harder and harder to manage. In order to access any of our private or sensitive systems, none of them were public. So it necessitated a connection to our corporate VPN, which over time became a management burden for us on CloudOps. We managed that actually for our employees. And then in the future, our IT staff was becoming very burdened with managing VPN configurations for every single new employee that came on board. And then our team, as with the new hiring that was happening, we were seeing an influx in very bespoke database access requests, and it was very not standardized in how these requests were coming in, and they were often not in line with previous access requests for similar employees and what have you. So we were really seeing some scalability issues with how we managed access to our data layer. All of that said, this is kind of summarized in this two-pronged flowchart. I mentioned the upper half, specifically for our database access. Our team, CloudOps, was responsible for maintaining the set of the hundreds and hundreds of database credentials for across all of our different clusters of services. And if you have ever used Ansible, that's what we were using. It's a configuration management tool that stores variables and tasks to execute in YAML files. These credentials for all of our human accounts were in encrypted Ansible variables files, encrypted YAML files, and we were effectively connecting to our VPN to gain access to these private systems, and then executing Ansible playbooks, as they're called, to behind the scenes run MySQL or Postgres or what have you queries to create new users, to update the access for new users for XYZ table in ABC database, et cetera, et cetera. And the bottom prong here is, or bottom of the fork is the other component of our sensitive infrastructure, which we'll call customer systems. Right, we deal with a lot of hospitals, and the access a lot of the servers that we spin up in order to communicate with their systems are Windows machines. Right, so there's a workflow that involves RDPing in through, again, our corporate VPN, and then if these systems lived on customer networks, they'd be through a business-to-business tunnel, so effectively daisy chaining a tunnel, and then doing our work in there. We are now starting to roll this out to also expand this to Windows servers that we host in our own Amazon account, which is the same as the bottom prong here, just minus the B2B tunnel, because previous to StrongDM, it was only required a single VPN connection and then a regular old standard RDP session, if you will, right? All of that culminated in the realization for us that the faster we were progressing, the more the friction in these pain points was slowing us down as an organization. These pain points that would have otherwise potentially gone unnoticed were starting to exacerbate and get more and more noticeable and slowed us down more and more. We knew we no longer wanted to be in the business of managing and curating YAML files for the database accounts across our infrastructure. And we also knew we didn't want to have an ecosystem in which hundreds of long-lived credentials and accounts were existed, right? For security and compliance reasons, right? The more long-lived accounts that you have and long-lived credentials you have in a system, the greater likelihood that something accidentally gets compromised and data access falls into the wrong hands, right? Another thing that we didn't really account for, which most people didn't, but can all relate to now, is with the pandemic, our remote workforce was starting to cause problems and put extra stress on a single point of entry into our private network, which is our corporate VPN, right? Previously, only very technical folks at the company needed to go through this VPN to access some internal systems because their access network level was granted to them automatically by being in our headquarters, in our office. But now, since going remote, effectively every single Olive employee requires a VPN to do their job, which puts further strain on our VPN and really exposed a bottleneck in productivity. And as we mentioned before, right, the whole reason for wanting to go to, one of the driving forces for wanting to go to single-click onboarding was the management of these bespoke access requests, right? The more people got hired, the more variability there was in what systems that these new employees needed access to and what levels of access they needed, et cetera. We truly needed to standardize around this so that we could scale effectively. So, right, the tagline here, in order to scale, something had to change. We knew we needed to introduce a new solution to these problems. And with any product we chose, there were some requirements that it had to fulfill, right? The first and foremost, number one, and in italics emphasized, is it had to be secure, compliant, and auditable. It had to offer full auditability of our systems. Being a HIPAA compliant organization, this was paramount, and there was no flexibility here. The solution we chose also had to support our entire stack. As I mentioned, with the new onboards and our crazy fast hyper growth, the plethora of tools at our disposal and the services in our landscape were just growing, and they were more and more variable. It could be anything from Amazon's RDS to Redshift to DynamoDB. I mentioned different RDP clients. And then we also needed to expose some internal APIs via HTTP connections to those that would downstream connect users to that data layer. And part of this, which I hope goes without saying, is it needed to be scalable. With the onboarding, with the introduction of dozens of new employees every week at our peak, we needed a solution that scaled with that onboarding, and also scaled with how large we decided to grow our infrastructure, which there's no real telling at this point in the near future. Who knows how large we're gonna get. We also needed to introduce a positive experience for our users. We did not want to introduce a pain point with another pain point, right? That pain point being for the management side of it from our team, CloudOps, and also the IT staff, but also for our end users as well. The previous paradigm of connecting to a VPN with no network issues, or rather network throughput issues, latency issues, we wanted to replace that with something that was seamless and did not require a corporate VPN connection, and also was easy to navigate for our users. And finally, the target state, which we'll get to here in a second, was single-click onboarding, facilitated by some sort of IDP, an SSO provider, right? We ultimately wanted to get to a point where a new employee is hired and their access to the systems that are required to do their job is provisioned automatically. So that brought us to StrongDM. Currently, the state of today is such that it is truly a single-click onboarding experience. A new employee is hired at Olive. Their account is created in Azure Active Directory, and their account is put into XYZ number of groups in that directory tree. Those groups are mapped one-to-one to roles in StrongDM, and those roles have predefined access rules that automatically grant the users in said role the access that they need. The only step after this for a new employee is to simply download and set up the StrongDM client locally on their machines. And within a single command of installing that executable, they are able to contribute to Olive, and they are able to start working right away. This is a pretty big jump forward for us. The outcomes of this were very profound for both organizationally, for productivity reasons, and for security and compliance reasons as well. Well, first of all, right, now that we went through StrongDM, those hundreds of database accounts that we mentioned earlier that we did not want to be in the business of managing, we were actually able to delete every single one of those, which was a massive compliance victory for us, greatly minimizing our attack surface and simplifying how we think about data access, right? We no longer need to audit hundreds of accounts. Rather, we can audit a single system in StrongDM, and it makes our lives and our security SecOps teams very happy, or very much easier, rather. More generally, it has since standardized our access patterns for database and the patterns we've established for granting database access. Single-click onboarding has meant that there are much fewer requests for changes in access. In the old world, where a new employee would have to submit a request to gain access to any number of database clusters and then all the tables inside of them, they are now bucketed into a group of employees based on their Azure Active Directory membership of similar employees, and they all get the same access. And it requests to change that access are only really required now if for example, a brand new group is onboarded and we need to create a whole new group structure and set up access permissions for that group, or an existing group has since changed scope and they require now access to a new database. But those requests, as you can imagine, are much fewer and far between, and are frankly easier to fulfill as well. Because it's really, with StrongDM, only requires a couple of clicks in the UI to update the access rules for an entire group of people, if not everybody in the company. Also, the end user experience for our users has been superb. Now, when a new employee is onboarded, they need not wait for both IT and CloudOps and security to approve a list of database access requests, but rather they are immediately productive on day one and can start poking around in the systems that they need to learn and interact with. And also, the user experience for connecting to databases now is considerably easier and better than it was previously. It's funnily enough, a couple of days ago, we heard in the wild an employee at Olive mention something along the lines of, "I love StrongDM so much, it has made access to databases so easy," which is kind of what we strived for. That was our end goal. And then finally, we really did gain some pretty significant auditability in this by choosing StrongDM. I mentioned we always had the network layer auditability, and we could, if we needed to, query the application level audits, but StrongDM offered that out of the box, and it made streaming that information to S3 in our case, and then querying it later much easier. So that's a lot of words on how this all was set up for us, but I think it'll get driven home after I hand it back over to Justin to give a quick little walkthrough on what it looks like to implement single-click onboarding.
Thanks, Kellen. That was a great account of the journey over at Olive AI. What I'm going to do now is show just a little bit hands-on in the StrongDM product. Obviously, we're going to be using a demo account because, as you stated, of course, your environment is very sensitive, very compliant. So we're just going to be using some dummy data here. But hopefully the concepts will translate. In terms of the upstream SSO or IDP, I'm also going to be demoing with Okta, which is almost the same as Azure AD, same behavior, but just a slightly different interface. So let's jump into it. First thing to understand is that what I'm going to be showing is a system of proxies that originate on the workstation and then convey traffic in this horizontal direction through a gateway proxy to some of these destination resources. And all of those gestures are coordinated by a control plane that distributes the configuration for those resources. So this is the network architecture that we're going to be experiencing here.
So the first thing an administrator will see is a listing, as you can see here, of users. So we have a listing of users, and you can see here this roles column. You can see that, let's focus in on this Justin user here. You can see Justin has no roles in the organization. And I'm actually logged in locally using the StrongDM client. You can see that's reflected also here in the client. There are no roles, and therefore there are no entitlements to any of those resources on the right-hand side of that diagram that we were just looking at. So what we've done in the product here is we've created a few different rules that govern, for example, how a given role might be allowed or disallowed to access some resources. So for example, here I'm focused in on the SRE role, and you can see that the SRE role has an access rule in place that allows every Redis instance to be accessed by anyone in the SRE role. As I mentioned, we have an upstream IDP in this demo account that is Okta. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go upstream into the identity provider, and I'm going to put this user into the SRE team. And that's going to be reflected through to this application. So that this no roles field here should reflect the group membership as configured in the upstream IDP. So here we are over in Okta, and the process of adding a group is fairly simple here, just like you would expect in any identity provider. And again, this is going to work in Azure Active Directory or any other provisioning environment with similar characteristics. So we can see here that Justin Timberlake now has the SRE group membership. We can see that that group membership has been reflected through to the StrongDM roles. And because that SRE role is entitled to access every Redis data source, those data sources are now reflected in the local client for every member of the SRE team, including now the Justin Timberlake user. So let's do a few more examples along those lines. So there are a few other teams that have a few different entitlements configured. So we've got, for example, the finance team has a similar rule, but this is for Postgres. So let's add Justin Timberlake to the finance team as well. So we're going to see back here, the finance team now also contains Justin Timberlake. Back on the user list, you're going to see finance and SRE. And then on the user's workstation, we're going to see the union of the rule of every Postgres database and the rule of every Redis resource. There are times when a very generic rule like every Postgres database may be overbroad. So we're going to spend a minute now just working on a little bit more of a refined definition. So let's say regarding the every Redis data source rule here, let's drill into that and delete it. So when we delete that access rule, the SRE role no longer has any entitlements to any of the resources. And you can confirm that by seeing that, in fact, from an end user point of view, the only resources that are visible are now the Postgres resources via the finance team membership. Let's go ahead and add a new access rule that has a little bit of more refined, focused scope. If we actually just briefly look over to the Redis instances, you can see here that these Redis instances each have an environment designator in the tag section here. You can see one of them is tagged environment QA, one of them is tagged environment dev, one is tagged environment prod. So let's go write a rule for the SRE team. That gives actually any resource of any type with the environment equals dev designation. Okay, so this combination of Redis and dev here is going to yield exactly one resource from the end user's point of view. And then on the other side of it, if we were to, for example, let's move this Redis QA into the env equals dev. So we'll just update that resource. And then as soon as that resource is updated, that's also going to be reflected through to the end user's point of view here. Okay, just a final thing to show on the other side of provisioning, because of course we're often concerned not only with getting folks the right resources according to their group membership, but we're also focused on removing those resources when they, for example, transition to another role or transition out of the company. So in this case, that's going to be as simple as removing those groups or otherwise suspending or disabling the user in the upstream IDP. Once those groups are gone, that user, again, has no roles. And any of those connections that were formed to any of those resources, such as to the Redis resource or to those Postgres resources, those connections are going to be cut immediately, of course. So that's pretty much it for the hands-on demo about how some of this access is conferred through these users using automation with an upstream identity provider. All right, that's it for our hands-on example. Thanks for playing along. So Kellen, really appreciate the experience that you shared with us from Olive.
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me on the talk here. Thanks for everything you guys have done over at StrongDM. And with closing, if you guys get a chance, feel free to check out oliveai.com and take a look at all the awesome things we're doing in the healthcare space.
All right. And for me, I'll say, please, if you haven't visited our virtual booth, happy to chat over there. And then you can always email me, justin@strongdm.com. Happy to share demos, happy to share anything else and answer any questions. So thanks again for attending.